Okay, I think we're getting ready to go now. I'll ask everybody to grab a seat. Good morning. My name is Ken Rasmussen. I'm Associate Director of the Johnson Chayama Graduate School, and it's my pleasure to be the moderator of this session on renewable and non-renewable resources, finding the right mix. So I'd like to welcome you all to this session. The session is going to be videotaped in the back, so when you do ask a question, make sure you come up and speak in the microphone and be aware, of course, that you will be on videotape when you ask a question as well. So if you don't want that to happen, you shouldn't ask a question. Each speaker is going to speak for about 20 minutes on this subject and their various subjects. And I'd like to introduce our distinguished panel right now. First of all, speaking first will be Duane Bratt. He's the Associate Professor of Policy Studies at Mount Royal University, and he's the Chair and Associate Professor in that department. He's got degrees from the University of Windsor and University of Alberta, and he's an international relations public policy specialist and is the author of a number of books, including The Prairie Atom, The Opportunities and Challenges of Nuclear Power in Alberta and Saskatchewan. And he's currently working on a book entitled Canada, the Provinces, and Global Nuclear Revival. Joe Muldoon is the Vice President of Environment and Forestry with the Saskatchewan Research Council. He's had a long career with the Saskatchewan Public Service, the Ontario Public Service, federal government agencies. He's got a master's in business administration and a bachelor of biology, and he's currently, I'm proud to say, working on his PhD at the Johnson Chayama Graduate School on nuclear energy as well. And finally, Tim Wiese. Wiese? That's the right. Sorry, I didn't want to mispronounce your name. He's the Director of Renewable Energy and Efficiency Policy with the Pembina Institute. He's a professional engineer. He has written on renewable energy and energy efficiency issues extensively. He is a consultant. He has completed a PhD with the University of Quebec at Rimouski, studying wind energy development in remote Canadian communities, and has a Master's of Mechanical Engineering from the University of Alberta, where he studied the adhesion to wind turbine blades. A very interesting and very relevant subject here in Saskatchewan, of course, as we're trying to pursue this. Now, I'm going to start with Duane, then Joe, then Tim. They'll each make a 20-minute presentation, and then we'll have a discussion. And if this morning's session is any indication, I think we'll have a very lively discussion on these extremely topical subject very topical subject matter. But we will also try to end at 11:55 because the minister is coming and we want to have this session wrapped up by then. So I will be ruthless in terms of my timekeeping and other things. And Duane, speaking on nuclear energy, he's promised to bring his talk in on budget and on time. So with that, we'll let him take the podium.
I also drafted, I did a PowerPoint, but for those that like complete sentences and footnotes, I also did a more complete paper that should be in your post-conference CD. What I'm going to try to do today is frame the debate in Saskatchewan. And so I want to begin by going to the December 2009 uranium decision of the Saskatchewan government, where they asked SaskPower to start looking at the possibility of nuclear energy post-2020. And given the regulatory process, the lead times, the construction process, 2020 means today. This was not, I think, completely understood in 2009 when they said this. There were media reports that said they said no, but I think by saying 2020, they're saying start looking. This was after the Uranium Development Partnership report came out, as well as the public consultation. This decision in 2009 has been followed up by Brad Wall's nuclear agenda, where he's emphasized three things. Focus on nuclear medicine, a focus on nuclear research and development that was tied into providing the University of Saskatchewan's Nuclear Studies Institute with $30 million in seed funding, as well as what he talks about small reactors. And you'll notice I bolded and put in red small reactors, because when I think of small reactors, I'm thinking around the 50 to 100 megawatt reactors designed for remote northern communities, et cetera. What they're talking about is reactors less than 500 megawatt. Now that may be small in comparison to the 1,300 that are currently being designed, but I see those more as medium-sized reactors. And just as an illustration, the Fukushima plants, which I will be talking about today, are 440 megawatts. So I think he's saying small, and I'd be very interested to know why they're using that term small. Maybe something to ask at lunch. So what am I going to do? I'm going to outline the drivers and the opposition for nuclear energy in Saskatchewan. The drivers that I'm going to walk through include increasing electricity demand, the possibility of exporting electricity to Alberta, managing or mitigating the effects of climate change, increasing the value added of uranium in Saskatchewan, as well as political support. Ken mentioned that I'm doing a book on the nuclear sector across Canada, and the drivers, some of them are common right across the country, but there are also different drivers within each province, and so this is the focus on the Saskatchewan. On the opposition side, I'm going to identify the major policy beliefs of opposition groups. I am going to identify some of the more prominent ones in Saskatchewan. I'm going to look at the public consultation process that occurred in 2009 and make some comments on that. And 3 weeks ago, I had this presentation done. Things have happened since then. So there is a fairly important section on the political and scientific impact of the Fukushima nuclear accident. And developments are still occurring on a day-to-day basis. I think it's too early to tell, but I will make some tentative statements. The debate in Saskatchewan really intensified with the UDP. And the UDP was asked to look at a variety of things, exploration and mining, conversion, enrichment, manufacturing, and nuclear reactors for electricity. My focus is going to be on the last point today, nuclear reactors for electricity, but it needs to be put into the context of a larger nuclear agenda. It was chaired by Richard Florzine. It was dominated by industry. It was designed to be a partnership, and it was designed to look at economic opportunities. And so, Duncan Hawthorne for Bruce Power, Jerry Grandy from Cameco, Armand Lefebvre, who was currently at that time president of Areva Canada, were all on the board, released its report in March 2009 and identified a number of priorities. Nuclear power generation in the province was one of them, and that became the real focus of the public consultation process. So that kind of sets the stage. Most of this should be familiar to those in Saskatchewan. Drivers, electricity demand. I've given a number of different stats, and we heard the same comments this morning about increasing electricity demand in the province of Saskatchewan. This has been identified not just by Bruce Power, who has a vested interest in looking at that because they're pursuing the construction of a facility, but also SaskPower. And it's not just the absolute numbers, it's the rate of growth that I think is important, both 2% and then 2.9%. Related to this is electricity demand in Alberta, and currently there is a major political battle going on about transmission lines in the province west of us. That will be a focal point not only of the PC leadership race, but also of the general election that will occur, depending on who you talk to, in the fall of 2011 or in the winter of 2012 on this, where they're building a massive upgrading of the electricity transmission system in the province of Alberta. Alberta has also said they're interested in nuclear energy. That's a different topic than what I'm looking at here. The UDP also identified significant potential for exports, and this is why Lloydminster has often been seen as a potential site selection to deal with both markets. And in the presentation this morning, they were talking about the absence, a relative absence of east-west transmission lines. This is something that would be required for this. Third driver is climate change. Climate change was a huge issue nationally, internationally, 2007, 2008. It has dropped off a bit on the political radar system, but it has not gone away. So just because it's not front page news does not mean climate change is over. I think this is a long-term issue. And given that 60% of Saskatchewan electricity comes from coal and natural gas, they are looking at ways of mitigating climate change and using nuclear power. SaskPower wants to get rid of coal-fired, as I point out here. It was mentioned, Saskatchewan's a major fossil fuel producer, so it's not just a consumer, it's also the producer. It has the highest per capita greenhouse gas emission rate, and overall, it is far surpassing where it should be. Nuclear power and a price on carbon can help to address that issue. So that is the third driver. Those electricity demand, climate change are common drivers across the country. What is new or what is different about Saskatchewan, I think, is the uranium aspect. Wall's comment, which he has said repeatedly about the next ounce of yellow cake will add any value, will be the first one. This was a major driver behind the creation of the Uranium Development Partnership and has been a consistent theme of multiple parties over decades in Saskatchewan. And so that could be conversion, that could be fuel fabrication, but clearly nuclear energy is part of that mix. And political support. I would call Brad Wall the most nuclear-friendly politician in Canada. If you like nuclear power, you think that's great. If you don't like nuclear power, not so much. But I think the facts speak for itself. He's the one who created the UDP. He put forward the Canadian Neutron Centre proposal of a large research reactor at the University of Saskatchewan. I've already touched on his commitment to the U of S's Nuclear Studies Institute. And clearly, he wants to replace coal plants with small nuclear facilities. Wall's position, I think, needs to be put in larger context of what I call 60 years of all-party support for the uranium nuclear industry in Saskatchewan. And here I'm just going through the various decades and what different parties have done, starting with the CCF, on through the Liberals, on through the NDP, on through the PCs, on through the NDP again. And so much of what Wall has been doing on the nuclear side, Lauren Calvert actually started, but Wall has taken it much further. Okay. Now, this is the Saskatchewan Party, and I realize that unlike Alberta, you have competitive elections in Saskatchewan. So the question would be, what if Brad Wall was defeated? What if he was replaced? Well, let's look at the NDP. The NDP has both a pro-nuclear wing that emphasizes economic development and the significance of uranium mining. The NDP also has an anti-nuclear wing that focuses on the military aspects, the safety of reactors, the environmental concerns. So you have these two conflicting elements within the same party. But in my looking at the history of the NDP on this issue, it appears that when they're in opposition, the anti-nuclear faction becomes more significant and more powerful, but when they turn into government, the pro-nuclear faction, the pro-nuclear wing, tends to become more dominant. And we'll have to see if the NDP replaces the Sask Party, either in this election or in a subsequent election, if that holds. So those are the drivers behind the debate of nuclear energy in Saskatchewan. There is also significant opposition. These are the basic policy beliefs of the anti-nuclear movement, not just in Saskatchewan, not just in Canada, but I think globally. So the idea that reactors are unsafe, that if we look at the entire fuel cycle from uranium mining up to waste disposal, causes cancer, reactors produce nuclear waste that lasts thousands of years, nuclear energy is not the solution to climate change. Instead, the focus should be on energy efficiency and renewables. They make the clear link between civilian nuclear energy and military bombs, and they talk about the uneconomic and highly subsidized nature. So these are the common arguments that are brought forward, and as I said, they're not unique to Saskatchewan. Within Saskatchewan, you have a couple groups. You have Clean Green Saskatchewan, you have the Saskatchewan Environmental Society, the Interchurch Uranium Committee, the Saskatchewan Union of Nurses put out a study, all condemning nuclear energy. And when the public consultation process was formed that included public hearings around the province, these groups mobilized. And so Dan Perron, and I believe I'm not sure if he's in the room, but he is in the building, as they say. There he is. Oh, there he is. All right. So you might want to either close your eyes or, or close your ears. Anyway, those are a list of the things that were done, right? Stakeholder conferences, the public hearings, which attracted much media attention, written submissions, opportunities for First Nations and Métis people, a website was created. Those are the number of hearings and email and letter responses. I have also done, not today, but in a different presentation, I did a comparison of the public consultation in Alberta and Saskatchewan. It was an absolutely fascinating case study because you had these two provinces, side by each, both conducting consultation processes that were completely different in many respects. And a good illustration is the role of public hearings, which put it on the front page and the lead story on the TV news, as opposed to private focus groups in Alberta, where unless you were following the issue very, very closely, you were unaware that public consultations were even occurring unless you were directly involved. The results were produced in The Future of Uranium. He was only asked to provide, to summarize the feedback, not to editorialize, not to make comments on the qualitative nature of the submissions, and these were the results. Okay? You can see very strong opposition to almost every single aspect of the nuclear sector, and I highlight here at the top 85% opposition to nuclear power generation. Okay, so that's what was in the report. Now let's take a look at it. Not statistically representative sample of public opinion. So you'd see headlines in the Regina Leader Post that say 85% of Saskatchewanians opposed to nuclear energy. That wasn't the case. It was 85% of those who participated in the process were opposed. But it did represent a very wide range, a very vocal range of opposition. Environment groups, labor unions, peace groups, religious groups, geographic scope right across the province. A range of arguments were relayed on economic issues, health issues, safety issues. What this showed is that the intensity of the opposition was much higher than the intensity of the supporters. And so the fact that anybody could go to those public hearings, the fact that they were dominated, even if the N was so small in relative terms to the population of Saskatchewan, I think sends a pretty strong political message, because it's not always the overall number of people in opposition or in support of something, it's how much they're in support or how much they're in opposition. So this illustrates high intensity. How can we reconcile then the decision of the Wall government in December of 2009 and the subsequent announcements following that with the results of this public consultation? It's almost like they held a public consultation, got the results, and ignored it. Well, there's a couple possible arguments. One is that the Wall government is massively pro-uranium industry and pro-development. The Wall government delayed the reactor decision, I would suggest, solely on the issue of cost, not on any other factors. So all of those safety issues, environmental issues, linkages with nuclear weapons production, I think were downplayed, but the issue of cost was important, and that was independent, I think, of the public consultation. So that's one aspect. How can we explain this gap between Wall's vision and public concern? Well, I would say Wall believed, as I believe, that there were aspects of the public consultation that were flawed. As I said, there's a difference between the responders and the submitters and the participants versus the public at large. In fact, Dan Perron said the same thing. He said there is no statistical reliability between this. The government, in its December 2009 announcement, said that independent polling, okay, which is random as opposed to self-selected, the people who participated in the public consultation self-selected themselves. It was not a random sample. Other surveys were random. And there were some methodological problems with the study, both in the coding and the factual accuracy of responses. One example on the coding would be that all submissions were treated equally. So Bob from Moose Jaw was counted as 1. The Saskatoon Chamber of Commerce was coded as 1. If Bob then went to the presentation in Regina, Bob is now 2. It'd be difficult for large organizations to do that. So that's an illustration of some of the coding problems. A second issue is that policymakers have to somehow balance expertise with democracy. So there's certain economic realities, scientific realities, where you rely on expert opinion as opposed to public opinion. If the public said, you know, we took a vote and we don't believe in gravity, gravity still exists. But at the same time, you can't ignore public opinion. So how do you balance these two elements? I believe that in this particular case, that the Wall government accepted the arguments from nuclear scientists and discounted public opinion. So that kind of frames the debate, okay, between what is driving this and what is opposed to this, and the debate is continuing. But then about 3 weeks ago, an extraordinary event threw it into the mix. When we've looked at the politics of nuclear energy, you have to acknowledge 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl. Now it's 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, Fukushima. So I want to briefly go through this. It was hit by what I call a trio of disasters. 9.0 magnitude earthquake, a massive tsunami, and a loss of electricity. And there's an illustration of where the earthquake hit, as well as the Fukushima plant, which is right about there. There was 6 units at this plant. Units 1, 2, 3 were in operation. They all shut down when the earthquake hit. So you'll have read reports that said, well, they were only designed for a 6.5 magnitude earthquake. In fact, they survived a 9 magnitude. The control rods went in, the reactors operated the way that they were supposed to. And in fact, when you look at footage of the area, it looks like the only thing standing in northeast Japan is the nuclear power plant. But the tsunami and the loss of electricity were the problems. There has been a melting of fuel. There has been a breach of the containment vessel. There have been the release of radioactive materials, and there have been several explosions in secondary buildings due to the venting of hydrogen. And there's just a diagram of the primary containment facility, which is in here, which has remained largely intact, although they have discovered some breaches, as opposed to the secondary containment, which had its roof blown off. Units 4 through 6 were not in operation at the time of the earthquake. They did not need to be shut down. However, there was an issue with the spent fuel storage bay. And to my mind, I may not be a nuclear scientist, but I have been looking at this for almost 20 years now. This is what concerned me. Because of a lack of a containment vessel over the spent fuel storage bay. I was pretty confident that the containment vessel would hold in units 1 through 3, but the absence of this, particularly I think it was unit 4 that had the most recent fuel rods put in, so they were the hottest, and there was an evaporation of water. Since that time, there's been a whole series of steps that the Japanese authorities have done. They've injected seawater into the reactor core, which also causes great damage due to the corrosive nature of seawater. They've brought in diesel generators, fire trucks and helicopters to spray water. They've been replacing pumps and valves. They've reconnected power lines, other emergency action. I think the worst of the crisis, in my view, is over. I think you're still looking at problems for the next month or so before they get to a cold shutdown. It is clearly the world's second worst nuclear accident, level 5 on the IAEA's International Nuclear Event Scale, and worse than 3 Mile Island because it involves multiple units. Anti-nuclear activists mobilized very quickly on this. This is a picture in Germany on the Saturday. So within 24 hours, they had created a human chain around one of the nuclear power plants in Germany, which already has a strong environmental movement. There has been a lot of media attention. In fact, there's been more media attention, some of it good, most of it bad. There's been more of it on the nuclear accident than on the earthquake and the tsunami. And there's a lot of discussion that I've had with journalism professors on why that's been the case. Gordon Edwards has become a prominent figure on CTV Newsnet. I don't have the slide here. I've got it in another presentation, which showed Gordon Edwards on the Friday speaking about the potential worst case scenarios, and the clip next to him was an oil refinery on fire. So if you're a viewer and you're watching it, you see this flames going up, you hear someone talking about worst case nuclear accident, and you put the two and two together when in fact it wasn't even the reactor. And so this media narrative, I think, has increased the anti-nuclear narrative. There's already been a bunch of actions around the world. Germany has temporarily shut down 7 old reactors. The EU is launching a safety review. The Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, the Ontario Energy are undertaking reviews. If you own shares in anything related to nuclear energy, your share price has dropped. The nuclear industry will be under significant pressure due to safety concerns rising to the top, but I still believe that these nuclear drivers still remain. All the nuclear drivers I began the presentation with are still today here that they were 3 weeks ago. And the question goes, what are you going to replace it with? In the case of Japan, I don't think they're going to back away from nuclear power. They have no coal, natural gas, oil. They have a small land mass. It's been the other 50 reactors that have been electrifying the country since the disaster. The Saskatchewan government has reaffirmed its nuclear agenda. This is a quote from Rob Morse, says that Saskatchewan has an ethical obligation. I quoted the ethical obligation, and they continue to work for small reactors in Saskatchewan. So I think it's too early to tell what either the scientific incident report in Fukushima will be, or on the political impact. So to kind of wrap up, because I've already got my 3-minute notice 3 minutes ago, but this is the last slide. So in one sense, in Saskatchewan, this is an old debate. The debate over nuclear energy in Saskatchewan goes back many decades. Many of the issues remain the same. Many of the actors remain the same. Many of the arguments remain the same, but there are new features. I think the climate change issue is one of those. I think the Fukushima accident is going to be another. I would say the booming nature of Saskatchewan, that doesn't get said very often, but the Saskatchewan economy the last couple years has been very, very strong. Those are all new features. So the question is there going to be a shift in public opinion as a result of Fukushima? And will there be a shift in the vision of the Wall government as a result of Fukushima? So I'm leaving this with no answers, just a whole lot of questions and things to think about, because I was asked to get a debate going. So.
Thank you very much, Dwayne. I'd like to ask Joe to come up now.
So are we going to get somebody to switch my presentation here?
Is there somebody that's going to switch the presentation? Is there a tech person in the room? Help me. You're going to take on? Okay.
Just while that's
Or
getting...
you can do it backwards.
I could do it backwards, yeah. Just while that's getting set up, I just want to offer a few comments at the front end of this. As Ken mentioned, I've worked in I would suggest the environmental resource field for the last 25, 30 years. And everything that I've done, it relates to, I'm a fisheries biologist by basic training, then I did a master's business administration. I'm still always working in the environmental resource side as a fisheries biologist, as a regulator, in a number of different capacities. I came back to the Graduate School of Public Policy, or came to the graduate school in 2006, I believe. And my interest was to look at, with the debates that were going on, with the energy mix, nuclear in particular, I wanted to come back to the academic world, or enter the academic world, be more like it, and try and apply what I consider to be, apply science to the debate, and try and get away from the the polarized views that exist, both in particular here in Saskatchewan, but elsewhere. And if nothing else, for my own value, to look at the science side and say, okay, what are the actual impacts from what I can gather? One person, one little bit of research, ongoing, I've not completed yet. But the comments that I offer today are basically based on the work that I've done through the graduate school and certainly not through the Saskatchewan Research Council. Although everything that you do, when you talk about energy, I mean, it goes through everything that you do in your life from the time you get up in the morning to the time you go to bed at night and all the way through. So it certainly does impact. And I followed the debate, attended many of those UDP meetings, and listened to the discussions with interest. Bit my tongue till it was bleeding on many evenings, but my intent was to sit back and listen. And I'll just offer you some of the comments that I not just so much from that, but just in terms of some of the work that I've done. If I can figure out how to use this thing. Okay, so first, I've got about six or seven slides, and it's mostly data, but it's not that boring, I don't think. If you want to hear me sing and dance, you'll like the slides a lot better. What's the right mix? So really, that's really what we're talking about here this morning. And for me, base load power first and foremost. Everybody, when we talk about energy, we got to talk about base load. What's going to be on 24 hours a day? And we can talk about where technology is going to bring us, and absolutely welcome that. But right now, we need base load power no matter what. In particular in northern climes such as we have here in Saskatchewan. So we've already heard Canada is one of the highest per capita emitters of greenhouse gases in the world. I think we're second in the OECD countries, second in the world. And Saskatchewan leads the country by a large margin in terms of our per capita emissions here in Saskatchewan. And you can see I pulled some of this off the SaskPower website, what our current fuel sources are here in the province. We've also, we've got really good, and this is from Sask Research Council, we do lots of work in the wind side, and there's tremendous potential here in the province with respect to wind and where we can go, and it is moving us forward. But I would come back to it's not base load. And so it's something that is a part of the mix, absolutely. Can it form the base? In my perspective, not for a lot of, it'll be decades down the road before we can get there. Welcome it to come when it can, but it's just not there yet. It was also talked about this morning a little bit was the demand management side. And that's something that we do forget about when we talk about the energy mix. And I think it's really important that obviously we can control and should control, have to control our demand. And there's all sorts of gains that can be made there. There's no question. But that's not going to solve our energy situation that we're in and what our needs are in the future. In Saskatchewan, the geography and the population are such that also creates some challenges for us, just in terms of straight up transportation and then heating and so on. How's that? That's not very good. Okay, so what I really want to look at, or want to talk a little bit about, is the environmental considerations, because that's really a lot of what I had studied over the last few years. We know that all energy creates environmental impacts. I don't care whether it can be anything from wind, in terms of the cement, the hazardous wastes that are created, in terms of running the machinery. It's no matter what we do, oil, gas, coal, wind, hydro, nuclear, they all create environmental impacts. And that's, if there's nothing else that I can leave you with this morning, keep that in mind. So it doesn't matter, it's there. So let's make sure that we know what it is, and I'll get there in terms of how I think we should deal with that. Our global energy demands, when we look globally, are going to be up 40% in the next 2 decades. So, and what we're saying now, or what the forecast is, that 3/4 of that growth is going to be met with fossil fuels. So that's a scary thought in terms of what we and us in Saskatchewan here in Canada, how can we impact that? What can we do? And obviously those kinds of increases are those kinds of demands, they're going to require baseload increases. We can't just deal with demand. We just can't deal with, in my view, strictly with renewables. We have to look at baseload. Environmental and health effects. Some old data here, some of it, but it's still pretty prevalent. The technology has not changed in a major way. We're getting there, but it certainly hasn't changed in a big way. Way back in the 1950s, London smog, 4,000 people dead in a week. Think about Fukushima, think about what's going on there, think about Chernobyl, and then bring that back into perspective in terms of the numbers here. Coal combustion responsible for 50,000 deaths per year in U.S. that occur. Now that's from air pollution. 80% of that comes from fossil fuel. The U.S. Office of Technology Assessment projected 50,000 deaths in the U.S. and Canada in 2000 due to air pollution. So it sounds strange, but if you want to make headlines, line up 57,000 people a year in a couple of Walmart parking lots and have them drop dead, and compare that with some of the. I know that sounds strange, but I mean we really have to think about all of our fuel sources and what they are actually, how they're impacting. American Lung Association, they had done some work in terms of looking if they could reduce the sulfur dioxide emissions that are produced by the coal industry down in the U.S. And they projected with strictly a reduction of 10 million tons of the SO2 emissions would save $50 billion in healthcare. Environment Canada 2005 projecting in the 8 major cities in Canada, brings it a little bit closer to home, 5,900 deaths per year related to air pollution. Again, mostly fossil fuel emissions. 800,000 worldwide. So let's look at our comparison of energy outputs. So when we think about basically megajoules per kilogram. So you have a kilogram of a fuel source. What do you get out in terms of energy content? And in terms of the CO2, one item, strictly one, but a very significant one, what's produced. So I mean, you can see the numbers. Coal at 40 megajoules per kilogram, you get 2.8 kilowatts per hour, 122 kilograms per 100 kilowatt hour produced. Across, you've just followed that down. Same with oil, very, very similar, a little bit more CO2. And obviously, technology will impact these numbers as well, but this is 2000 data. Natural gas, you can see the numbers across, a little reduction, a little better fuel. Energy output's a little higher, reduction in greenhouse gases. Nuclear energy, megajoules, in particular, look at the megajoules, 960,000 megajoules per kilogram of energy coming from a kilogram of fuel. Your energy output's 270,000. Your CO2 is now 0. And again, if you want to put in building the plants and so on, there certainly are some outputs there. So I don't want to argue that. What I'm saying is, I look at from the science side. If we look at those kinds of outputs, surely to heaven, there's ways that we can use nuclear energy that are safe, and that we don't have to. We're not going to solve this today. We're not going to solve it next week, but maybe over the next couple of decades, we can get to a point where we can utilize that kind of energy source, along with some of the other ones. I want to talk a little bit about level playing field, and the reason I showed some of that data earlier on is to bring us back to that level playing field. And for me, what I call that is full cost accounting. So level playing and full cost accounting means that we count in the energy output what's the cost to society. And then when we make those decisions on the energy sources, let's do that what I would call on a level playing field. Sounds simple, obviously it's not, and it's very difficult to get there, but it's something at a minimum we have to start to take into consideration. So what I would suggest is obviously the full cost of the energy source should be taken into account. These costs should not be relegated as future societal costs, including nuclear, including wind, including coal. We look at the situation down in the Gulf Coast with some of our spills. So we have to look at this right across the board. Fossil fuel utilization should account for environmental and health impacts. We need to keep those things in mind, and I don't think that as policymakers and as regulators and as society that we're doing that at this point, and I think we need to. What I'm saying is policy derivation can't be conducted in a vacuum. We've got to take all of these things into account. Let's bring this back into the climate change side, which I've kind of, in a sense, touched on it, but just a little bit more. I mean, there's no question that climate change is occurring. That debate's long over. We do have carbon tax in some areas. We can, in BC we have it. We've got it in Alberta, and it's something that is coming in some fashion, whether we call it a tax or no matter what we call it. And again, there was a good discussion on that this morning. So it's not a matter of if changes need to be made, but when. We definitely have to start to move ourselves forward. How we do that in little Saskatchewan, in little Canada, in a global environment is the challenge. So really that's what's in front of us from my perspective. We have to take this full cost accounting into account. The transition isn't going to happen tomorrow, isn't going to happen next week. But we have to move away from either clean up in the fossil fuels, clean coal, carbon sequestration, great. I would suggest they're shorter term solutions than the longer term. We have to get into longer term solutions. It's a huge challenge for one country to solve in a global economy, because that's what we're dealing with. But it's interesting. The debate this morning was talking about how can we in Saskatchewan, how can we even think about putting together a national energy strategy because of all of the challenges across the country. Bring that further out. What about in the North American context? What about in the global context? But I still firmly believe that in Saskatchewan, where we have just a tremendous sources of energy, variable sources of energy, that we can find many of those solutions here. Small nuclear reactors as one, wind, lots of renewables, clean coal when it makes sense, if it makes sense. We have to move down that road. We know that coal on a global basis is going to be expanding, and the Chinas and the Indians of this world, they are going to be using coal. They're not going to necessarily be using the new technology. So what can we develop here that we can export globally in terms of from the clean coal and other perspectives in terms of fossil fuels that we can make us move us to a leader in the world stage? And I firmly believe that we can get there if we start with baby steps, talk about full cost accounting in terms of looking at the full cost, and then from there trying to change the rhetoric. Which is what it is, and getting more into actual discussions and designing and delivering public consultation and other consultation processes that are going to move us down the road. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. We'll get Charlotte to set up the next presentation, and I'd like to ask Tim to come up. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, everyone. I'm here to make the case for renewable energy. I guess I also want to touch a little bit on the session was talking about the importance of policy, and isn't policy important in sort of choosing what direction we want to go. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about what's going on globally and how that relates to what policies have driven our energy decisions. So I'll just introduce myself and the Pembina Institute. We're one of Canada's largest environmental think tanks. I'm based in Edmonton, but we have offices in all across the country. And I spent the last couple of years living in Ottawa, so I understand things from a federal perspective as well. We've been around for 25 years. We were founded as a result of one of Canada's worst industrial accidents, and so I think when we talk about fossil fuels, we have to also remember that there are direct human costs, not only in terms of pollution, but also in terms of the danger of developing these energy sources. And the Lodgepole blowout was a sour gas blowout, which sort of, as our group became a citizens group as a result of that accident 25 years ago in Drayton Valley. So my background is mechanical engineering. I'm a professional engineer, registered in Alberta, and I've also got a master's degree from U of A, as well as a PhD in environmental science. All of our publications are available for download, so that's where you can find them if you're interested in seeing any of this stuff. But I think what's a little bit unique from the Pembina Institute's point of view is we also do groundwork. We actually work with communities, work with companies, and do consulting work as well. And so we're a think tank, but we're also a consulting agency at the same time. And so these are some of the projects that I've worked on and understanding what some of the ins and outs of renewable energy are. And so I guess I can speak from firsthand experience in terms of what's possible and also what can go wrong. And that is the collapsed wind monitoring tower there. But I think what's driving really what we need to be thinking about, and I would echo the previous participants are saying, is climate change. Although it seems to have fallen a little bit off the public radar, I think what's scary about climate change is all of the major scientific papers, or the IPCC, sort of the large body that governs looking at climate change globally, have underpredicted what we're actually seeing in terms of the pace of climate warming, the pace of Arctic sea ice disappearance. We're actually seeing what's worse than what they thought was worst case scenario, and so we really have to get on with where we want to go. This is numbers for Environment Canada, sort of showing where our current target is. So the blue line there is where the current federal target is in the next 10 years, and where, this is the government's own publications, where the current policies are going to take us, which is about a 65 megaton reduction from business as usual. So we've got 178 megatons just to meet the government's own targets to go. So we've got a lot of, there's a big gap between where we say we're going and where we actually are going at this stage in the game. So where are those greenhouse gases coming from? I'm going to focus today on electricity. I think that's what we're all talking about. And that's about 16% of our overall greenhouse gas emissions. But it's important to point out that we're probably, if we're seriously going to be tackling climate change, we're probably going to be moving some of our other sectors, particularly transportation and building heating, onto the electricity grid. So the electricity sector is going to be playing a more and more important role. Looking at where the largest sources of greenhouse gas emissions are, these are the 5 largest sources of greenhouse gas emissions. You can see 2 of them are oil sands plants, 3 of them are coal plants, 1 located here in Saskatchewan. The Boundary Dam is the 5th largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in the country. And then in terms of absolute emissions, you can see where all the different provinces are. In Alberta and Ontario, the 2 largest sources of greenhouse gas emissions in their electricity sector. But both Ontario and Nova Scotia are actively phasing out their coal plants. Ontario much more aggressively than Nova Scotia, but those greenhouse gas emissions are going to be dropping in those 2 provinces, and Ontario already is dropping very rapidly. Saskatchewan and Alberta are probably heading in the opposite direction right now, and so we need to be considering that really seriously in terms of what decisions we're going to be making going forward. Right now, Saskatchewan is about 40 or close to 50% coal, not as dependent on coal as Alberta, but still heavily dependent on coal, and that is the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions globally. The other big issue that we're facing, I think in Canada writ large, but particularly in Saskatchewan, is that most of our electricity system is old. We haven't invested in an electricity system seriously in 30 to 50 years. A lot of the old plants, whether it's nuclear plants, whether it's coal plants, in particular our transmission system, is all coming to the end of its life, or coming to the end of its design life. And in Saskatchewan, that's true for coal as well as for natural gas. And so not only are we facing the question of growing demand, but we're also facing the question of aging infrastructure. And so we have sort of these 2 problems that we're facing at the exact same time. The reason I think, and this is coming back to Alberta a little bit, but coal, when we're addressing those questions, coal is a major problem. If you look at, there's a lot of focus on oil sands. I think oil sands gets a big public black eye, and probably for good reason. But these are the data from Alberta showing that the relative emissions from oil sands are roughly the same as the relative emissions from coal, just in the province of Alberta. And so there's a lot of international focus on oil sands, but just in the province of Alberta, coal is an equal problem at this stage in the game. So we're going to have to be doing, I hope that sets the stage for the case that we need to be doing significant changes in terms of the direction we're headed right now, and that's true in Saskatchewan as much as it is in the rest of the country. The good news is renewable energy has really come of age. We're seeing massive growth in renewable energy globally, and I think what's interesting to point out here is the growth in renewable energy really started only about sort of 10 years ago. And I think the boom really took off in the early 2000s. And so when we talk about renewables, if you're talking sort of beyond 10 years ago, you're talking about ancient history. Things have radically changed in the last 10 years in terms of technology as well as in terms of investment. We're seeing massive growth in wind power. We're seeing massive growth in solar power. Germany has become the world's largest market for solar energy, and China has recently become the world's largest market for wind energy. In fact, in 2009, in the last 4 years, we saw 230% growth in clean energy investment. Those numbers in 2010, in spite of the global recession, that number jumped in terms of global investment to $240 billion. In spite of the global recession, we still saw exponential growth. In fact, if you include large hydro on this, in 2008 was the first year that we actually saw more money was invested in renewables than was invested in new coal, natural gas, and nuclear combined. That was true again for 2009 as well as 2010. And so we're talking about investment in new infrastructure and new technology. Renewables really needs to be front and center. We can't be thinking of it about it as a boutique, nice to have, sort of 2, 3, 4%. But we need to be understanding the capacity for renewables really is at a very, very high penetration levels. In fact, a little bit in contrast to what the previous speaker was saying, this is John Wellinghoff, who's the head of the Federal Regulatory Commission in the States, and his suggestion was that we don't need any more coal or any more nuclear plants in the United States because the technology has advanced that we don't need to be thinking about base load in the way we did in the past. If we have sources that are dispatchable, that can match with variable sources like wind energy, we're capable of balancing those loads out, and we don't need to be thinking about baseload technology the way we have in the past. And again, that's the chair of the Federal Regulatory Commission in the United States saying that, not the Pembina Institute. We can integrate huge amounts of wind power at national scales. Iowa, obviously not a state or a country, but 8% of their state supply of electricity coming from wind. Germany's at 9%. Denmark, on average, is about 22% of their national supply is coming from wind. And on the right-hand side, you can see it's in Spanish, but what the press release is saying is that on November 8th, 2009, 53% of their national electricity was supplied by wind power on that particular day. So we're talking about, we're not talking about boutique amounts of power at this stage in the game. This is an entire country with half of its electricity supply coming from wind on that particular day. So what policies drive us in this direction? How do we want to get there? There's all sorts of different policies that we can be putting in place, and I think one of the problems that we've talked about this morning is that we don't have a cohesive direction that we're going in Canada. All the different provinces are doing different things. Federally, there was incentives, now they're gone. We might have some sort of carbon price. We don't know what it is. It might be looking at what the states are doing. Maybe it's not if they're not going to move. And so I think it's difficult. I remember I was speaking to a manufacturer of wind turbines, Vestas, incidentally, that wind turbine in the back there, and they were saying, why would I want to set up shop in Canada when I have to deal with 10 different countries? Because each province operates like its own little fiefdom, and I think that's part of our problem is we're moving in different directions without sort of an overall cohesiveness to our policies. But we do need overall direction in terms of where we're going, because I think that helps set the direction not only in terms of what targets we need to be achieving to be setting our utilities in certain directions, but also understanding what's going to help drive investment. And I think Germany is a strong example of setting strong targets, which then drive the market and help drive those decisions. They're looking at 80% renewable power in the entire country within the next 40 years. Those decisions to meet that target obviously need to be made today. Those are 40-year decisions. If we were to build a coal plant today or a nuclear plant today, it would be operating in 2050. So even though that seems like a long way out, those types of targets resonate in terms of the decisions you need to be making today. And in order to hit those targets, Germany actively needs to be phasing out what it currently has in the system. Germany has exceeded its 2010 target. They actually hit 15% in the year 2009. So they have set targets that they've been able to achieve and exceed. I think some of the examples we need to be looking at in Canada in terms of on coal in particular, Ontario is actively phasing out its coal plants. It's likely to see the entire fleet offline in the next 4 years. The government anticipates that will be a $3 billion a year savings in terms of healthcare costs. And Nova Scotia is actively ramping down its coal fleet quickly. They've legislated within the next 5 years to have 25% renewable power and 40% renewable power in the next 10 years. And I think Nova Scotia is an interesting example for Saskatchewan because in a lot of ways it's a smaller province, but it's got a similar energy mix, and it's also similarly, the grid isolation is similar in Nova Scotia as it is to Saskatchewan. So those are the types of targets that I think is realistic we should be talking about in Saskatchewan. But if we want to get there, we need to understand that policies drive these decisions and policies that drive where we want to be going. As I said, the reason we need to be thinking about incentives or giving renewables a leg up potentially is that the current system has already had massive investment, whether it's massive subsidies from the government or whether it's public investment that's been amortized over many years. And we're also not reflecting the true costs of our current energy system. As I said, the health impacts of coal are currently not borne by the coal industry. The issues of climate change are currently not internalized. We've also been directly subsidizing the competition to renewables. We have direct investment from the government in carbon capture and storage. Again, this year's federal budget saw another $400 million in nuclear subsidies, bringing the nuclear subsidies up to $1.8 billion in the last 3 years. And so we're seeing direct subsidization at a federal level in competition to renewables. But I think the biggest subsidy, particularly around nuclear issues, is the liability subsidy in Canada, where currently, if there was a nuclear accident in Canada, that the utility would be on the hook for $75 million. The rest would be borne by us, the taxpayers. And so that's probably the largest subsidy there is right now. There was legislation on the books, I think, to increase that to about $600 million. That died when the government collapsed last week. So those are the types. So I guess the point I want to make is that it's difficult to extract the current electricity system and suggest that somehow the market can now just perfectly take over, because we have sunk subsidies, we have sunk costs. And I think particularly around the issue of transmission, the transmission system currently favors large centralized plants. And so, you know, the current system already gives a certain leg up to existing infrastructure and existing technologies. So the other thing that I think we need to be putting on a radar is the issue that I said earlier, is that renewables are growing really, really quickly, and there's going to be technologies, I think, that are coming on faster than we're anticipating. And are we going to be ready to capture those technologies? And what are they going to do to some of the investments we make? Germany right now, in terms of the scale of development, added 3,500 megawatts of solar in 2009 and added roughly 8,000 megawatts of solar in 2010. So we're talking about massive investments in solar power. They're targeting 3,000 megawatts of new solar power per year. So let's just play around with some fun with some numbers in Saskatchewan. Germany is about half the size of Saskatchewan. So in terms of what's possible in Saskatchewan, let's just double the potential, or double the output in terms of land mass availability. Saskatchewan's got about a 50% better solar resource. What's currently in the ground in Germany in terms of solar could be producing about 20 terawatt hours per year, which is Saskatchewan's current demand. So we could be, Germany's already producing that with their, Germany's producing lower than that, but if you were to double the size of the country, theoretically we could be producing 100% of the power in Saskatchewan from solar. It's technically possible. I'm not saying it's cost effective, but technically we could do it. The International Energy Agency is saying that within the next 40 years, we'll be seeing between 20 to 25% of the world's supply is likely to come from solar. So solar is growing at a rapid rate, and I think we need to be understanding that if we're going to be making long-term 50, 60-year investments in nuclear power and coal generation and CCS, what happens if a new technology comes online that's suddenly going to undercut some of those long-term investments? So those are some of the issues I think we need to be thinking about when we're reinvesting in our energy infrastructure. Obviously, there's challenges to integrating these types of renewables. Balancing the issues is going to be important. I think storing renewable technology or storing power is going to be an issue going forward. Transmission is an ongoing problem in Canada, not only in terms of the aging infrastructure, but most of our provinces are poorly interconnected to one another. We don't connect very well east-west, and most of the connections we have go north-south. I think another important thing is that prices are going to be increasing regardless of what we do. So whether we go down a renewable path, whether we go down an increased nuclear path, even if we go down an increased investment in coal, we're going to be seeing increases in prices. And that's going to hit individual consumers in the pocketbook, and there's going to be some public reaction to that. And I think we're seeing that in Ontario right now. And I think some of the decisions that were made by that government didn't understand, I think, the degree of public backlash and public literacy around where those prices are going to be going. And so governments need to be aware of that regardless of what choices they make. Again, this is illustrating the imports and exports across Canada, and the point I want to make with this slide is that most of our electricity does flow north-south as opposed to east-west. So in terms of how quickly can we be getting renewables out, how quickly is it possible? And this is a slide from Denmark, and in about 20 years, how they moved from basically large centralized operating plants within about 20 years to a very decentralized system. So it can be done in very quick periods of time. I think we need to get away from the idea that, well, these are technologies that one day are going to happen or one day we'll get there. But Denmark set its mind to it and decided it was going to do it, and it did it in a very short period of time. And here's a quote from the Danish electric system operator, who was basically testifying to his own government and said that, we said the electricity system could not function if power increased above 500 megawatts. Today, and this is almost 10 years ago, we're handling 5 times as much as that power, and I'm here to tell the government that we can handle even more. And so the point is that these things aren't without growing pains, and the Danish electric system operator even thought they couldn't do it, and now they're doing actually about 6 times what they thought was impossible at one point in time. And so this goes to show what happens when you have government policies that force the operators, force the engineers, force the utilities a little bit out of their comfort zone and into areas that the government wants to go and that people want to go. So to sum up, Saskatchewan, just like the rest of Canada, really is at a crossroads at this stage in the game. We've got major decisions we need to be making about new infrastructure. We've got major decisions we need to be making about transmission. And what the decisions we make in the next 5 to 10 years are going to be in the ground for the next 40 to 50 years. And so now is the time to be making those decisions, but also now is the time we're effectively locking in our electricity system for a long period of time for our children. There has been huge growth in renewables globally. We're seeing it at an exponential scale globally. I think what China's doing in the next few years is going to really change the market. We've seen significant growth in Canada, but again, it's been disjointed. We're seeing certain provinces moving in some directions and other provinces moving in other directions. And what we're still missing is a cohesive Canadian target or trajectory to expect investment in Canada at a large scale. As I said, the market, I don't think reflects the true cost, not only of impacts on our health or on the climate, but also doesn't necessarily reflect historic subsidies. And so if we want to invest in renewables, I don't think we should be ashamed in saying public dollars should be going into cleaner energy if that's what we want. And at the end of the day, I think Saskatchewan needs to be asking itself the question, same with Alberta, is currently Saskatchewan and Alberta are part of the climate change problem. There's a massive renewable energy resource in both provinces. How can we switch that to actually being part of the solution and exporting clean energy to other provinces and to other countries? Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank all 3 speakers for their comments. And of course, there's nothing controversial here, so we can all just head off to lunch, I guess. And but I'd like to thank them for all the information and the interesting perspectives on this crucial topic, one that I think is the discussion is just getting going, and we're happy to be part of it. So, if there's any questions. I would ask people to step up to the mic and indicate where you're from. Maybe I will, if I see no immediate takers, I will let people rustle their papers and get up there and ask a quick question of Tim, and others can jump in. And one of the things that we didn't talk too much here about is the fossil fuel issue. But it's not only about electricity in Saskatchewan. It's not only about the domestic consumption, and the same is true in Alberta. It's really it's an export aspect. I mean, you can create all the wind farms you want in Alberta and in Saskatchewan, but it's not going to add anything to the economy the way that oil exports do and natural gas exports do. And so it's not just. I mean, we could just sit around and wait until the Danes go through all the problems and all the huge government subsidies, and in 20 years, when they've developed this technology, we'd be happy to purchase it. But is there a real appetite for this? If you say to Alberta, well, we're kind of biting the hand that feeds us, literally in both Alberta and Saskatchewan, those exports make up a huge part. I'm wondering if you've thought about that aspect of this, as well as the other, both Joe and Brett on the nuclear side.
I could probably go on longer than my presentation to answer that question, but I'll just make a handful of points. The first is renewable energy actually tends to be, because it's less energy dense, it requires more people. So typically you end up with more jobs per megawatt on an economic creation or economic development capacity than you do with fossil fuels. So if you look on our webpage, we recently released a report on green jobs that sort of outlines those numbers to that effect. Probably the most important thing, though, is I don't think we're talking about an overnight transition. We are talking about sort of a 30 to 40, maybe a 50-year transition. And I think that's partly where it ties back into the overall national strategy is if we're developing the oil sands, why are we developing the oil sands? To what end, I guess? And I think that's the question that we haven't really asked, I think, in Alberta or in Canada at large is if we're going down this road, what's the long-term prospects? Where are we putting that money? What's the long-term investment? What's the long-term thinking? You're right that there's all sorts of jobs that are created. There's all sorts of economic development that's created. But that can also come to an abrupt end. I think in 2008, Alberta went from a red-hot economy to the highest unemployment in Canada within 1 year. The quickest change in unemployment in 1 year. So the point is, we're also putting a lot of eggs in one basket at the end of the day. And so I think we need to be thinking about, I'm not suggesting we make a transformation overnight, but the issue is, how do we diversify our thinking? How do we, not only as a province, but as a country, what's the long-term strategy, I guess, in terms, and I think that sort of relates to what we're talking about as an overall conference here. If we are going to be using these fossil fuels, to what end?
Okay. Dwayne or Joe?
Yeah, I would take a look at this from a different angle, and that would look at the issue of electricity exports. When I talked about the drivers for electricity generation being different province to province to province, you see the large number of exports that Hydro-Quebec does into the United States, into New York State, for example. One of the drivers for the refurb in Point Lepreau and the feasibility studies around a second reactor are electricity exports into New England. Then you shape that to Alberta, where there's a major battle going on about transmission lines, and you keep hearing, well, this is about exporting electricity to the United States. And when they say that, they say it in a very bad way. And this is a province whose economy is based on exporting oil and gas to the United States. Oil and gas exports, good. Electricity exports, bad in Alberta. In Quebec, electricity exports, good. So it really highlights some of the differences province to province to province.
I would still get back to that efficiency diagram that I put up, and I think that we're not going to change. And I think all the speakers have said nothing's going to change overnight here. But we've got decisions to make in the province here. We're replacing a very large percentage of our generating stations here in the next 10, 15 years. Major overhaul. And those decisions, we can't wait 50 years to make those decisions. We have to make those decisions now. So what do we have now? What's going to work now? We're still going to export our oil and our gas. There's no question. So let's make that as clean as we can. We know that we're going to get into some sort of an arrangement with a North American system, whether it's cap and trade, whether it's some kind of carbon, whether it fits across the country, whether it's in Western Canada. I mean, there's many different ways of going there, but we know we're going there. So that's fine, let's do that. So when we talk about a mix, I think the key here is mix. So we are going to have a mix here. We are still going to have oil, and we're still going to have gas. We're going to have coal, but the coal, the way that we're doing it now, isn't going to work. It has to be clean coal at a minimum. And if we're really, and again, that comes to that level playing field. And if we go to clean coal, then let's look at efficiencies. What makes sense? If we look at our electricity going east and west, and Dwayne talked about this, what about a nuclear power plant on the western side of the province? I think there's huge potential for that. Do you know that all of the air, most of the air emissions that come out of the coal powered and the oil sands in the western part of Alberta, they don't impact Alberta. They impact Saskatchewan. All of those emissions are coming our way. So we need to think about getting much bigger than Saskatchewan and looking at Western Canada. And I think there's some of those policies we're starting to hear about these that are moving us forward. And it all comes down, I'll come back to efficiency and mix. There's all sorts of room for renewables. I think there's room for a good expansion of nuclear. Looking at the research, clean coal technology, it's all of those pieces all together, but we can't sit still. And right now, our energy policy, both in Western Canada and across the country, is in my view, is in a vacuum. We're not going anywhere right now.
Thank you very much. Other questions?
I'm Brian Brunskill. Dwayne, I'm wondering if you could fill a gap for me. If our intention were to move in Saskatchewan towards more nuclear and away from coal, if that's the intention, if we actually moved that in that direction, would we stop mining coal? Would we leave it in the ground, therefore avoiding emissions? Or could we do that? Or would we become just an exporter of coal, so it would be combusted somewhere else? Do you have any insight on what that intention might be?
I haven't heard any intent of the Saskatchewan government on coal mining. Most of the discussion I've heard has been around coal generation. Sure. And so I can't answer that. What I can answer is on the nuclear side is irregardless of whether nuclear energy is in Saskatchewan, they will still be mining uranium. So I think that's a different set of calculations than in the coal industry. But I don't know about the extent of coal mining after this.
Sure, okay. Just the full cycle. We tend to pick the pieces we like out of these stories, but we don't look at the full cycle, even if we're burning it somewhere else or someone else is burning it. So it gets off Saskatchewan's statistic as an emission, but it's still a global emission. Thanks.
Additional questions? Yes.
My name is Kathleen Livingston. I'm the Executive Director with the Saskatchewan Environmental Industry and Managers Association. Tim, I'm intrigued by your use of the European example, both in terms of Germany and in terms of Denmark, with respect to the public policy drivers behind their transfer to renewables. And while I'm a big fan of renewables and I'm a big fan of innovation in Saskatchewan on that front, I also recognize that public policy needs to be the driver there. What we lack in Saskatchewan that drives public policy is people, because we don't have the density of population that makes many of those options economically viable. Secondly, we have an embarrassment of geography. And thirdly, we have cheap natural gas and cheap coal and cheap uranium. And so the challenges of public policy development in the face of all of those criteria and the fact that even though we're per capita terrible polluters, our global footprint is really minuscule. I would be interested to hear your comments and the comments of the rest of the panel with respect to how you overcome the inertia on public policy.
Good question. I think one thing that Saskatchewan and Canada as a whole needs to stop sort of downplaying and minimizing itself in terms of its overall impacts. The issue of climate change is one sort of the tragedy of the commons, in a sense that it's not, there isn't one place where we can put our finger and say this is the problem. It's every single person's small contributions that add up to a major issue. China right now is the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions globally. But you could subdivide China down to each province and each city and each person, and that person could say, well, my impact is minimum, so there's nothing I should do. And I think the same thing goes for Canada. And our federal government currently makes the argument that Canada is only 2% of global emissions, therefore, we're actively trying to ingrain that in people that we're so small not to worry about it. And I think Denmark is an example of a country that did the opposite. I mean, who would have thought that Denmark could have revolutionized a whole technology industry? This is a country of 5 million people. So I think we need to get out of that mentality that there are things, regardless of what the rest of the world is doing, we need to get on with it locally, and whether that's for local air emissions or whether that's for our global environmental footprint, we need to be getting on with it. How you end up changing public policy, that's a good question. Ultimately, I think one of the reasons Germany is so far ahead is because the population within Germany is very engaged and wants to be a part of the solution. And the policies they have in place actually in Germany allow individuals to be a part of. Any individual in Germany can put up a solar panel on their roof. In fact, 50% of the wind turbines in Germany are owned by farmers and by cooperatives. And 90% in Denmark are owned by farmers and cooperatives. So putting policies in place that engage individuals, that get people involved, that get individuals involved, I think that's an important part of changing overall public perception about these technologies, and the mystique about these technologies is allowing people to be a part of that change.
For me, I would suggest that in order for us to really get through this inertia, what I would call the policy vacuum in public policy around energy, is to bring it out into the marketplace and get business actively involved with it. And so we create an environment where business not only, I don't want to say has to participate, but although there's a piece of that has to be, but also wants to participate. So from an economic side, what sorts of policies can we create to get into the discussion, and because we have to bring them to the table, and then talk about what opportunities can we create here. We've talked a little bit about that in terms of exporting some of our technologies and some of the ways that we do business. But I think it has to be bigger than that. It has to be broader than that, where we actually bring business in and sit down and talk about what can we do, and the status quo is not on. So we can't just be an open book of what do you want to do. I mean, we have to come in we have to open up that dialogue with some ideas and some discussions, and that we are moving forward. And there's no question about that. And we're going to do this, in the Canadian context or in the Western context or in the Saskatchewan context. However we're going to start, how do you want to be involved? We want you involved. You have to be involved. Let's get you, because the marketplace will drive everything. And if we don't look as a country, we talk about sovereignty and what we own and what we don't own. Well, really, if we think about it, our energy agenda, I'm not so sure that we own it, really, in a sense. But we do own the policy agenda. So maybe we can create ways of bringing that market, bringing that business community into the discussion in a significant way. I'm just not talking about talking around the edges.
I'm not going to get so much into specifics. I'll put my professorial hat on and give a bit more of a theoretical background on how public policy change is made. And there's a famous model developed by John Kingdon that talks about policy windows. And what it requires is problems, okay? Being able to define the problem as one stream. Then a second stream as ideas and policies that are circulating around within government, outside of government, within NGOs, within industry, trying to solve those problems as a second stream. And then the third stream is the political process has to be there. It has to be right. It can't occur in the middle of an election campaign, all sorts of things as the third stream. And an example that I'll give is, let's say we find someone who's got the answer to solve Middle East peace, okay? But that man's name is Gaddafi, all right? We're not going forward, right? So it requires those three streams: problems, policies, politics, all coming together at the same time and exploited by a policy entrepreneur. And so you look at the transformation of Canada to a free trade system, you know, it was Brian Mulroney who was the policy entrepreneur that brought all those three things together at the right time and moved forward. You look at Denmark, the conditions in Denmark to move forward on wind is when those three things emerged at the same time. So that would be sort of my answer, to provide that policy window when those three things happen at the same time. One note of caution, though, is that these policy windows open and that they close very rapidly. And if you miss the window, next to the window of opportunity is the trapdoor of disaster. And so if you go through and you miss it, you don't hit the wall, you plummet. And so that's a more academic answer. Sorry.
We have time for one more question, if anybody is so inclined.
Doug Sovereign, Saskatchewan Research Council. It's easy to make policy, and I'll give you a real good example where policy fails, the Kyoto Accord. You know, that was only talked about a 9% drop in CO2 emissions, and we failed miserably, we gave up. And so policies are easy to make. It's only if the technology can advance and advance towards that policy, and there will be failures, and you have to back off at some point in time. And I don't really hear about. You can't make a policy at all costs, I don't think. And I just concerned that we'll drive this. And you know what drives the solar industry in Germany, for example, is power costs, not quite 10 times for solar generated power, but something like that. It's about 45 cents a kilowatt hour, I believe. In Ontario, for solar power, you get 80 cents a kilowatt hour. And in the mix, you can afford that, but you can't afford that at 50% sort of thing. And so ultimately, some of these technologies won't make it. You know, I don't, and I'm not optimistic about energy storage, for example. We know pretty much everything we know about batteries that we know. We can make them more compact, but the chemistry is fixed by the periodic table. So some of these things can't be solved, and we have to recognize that. It's easy to make a policy and say we're going to make a magical discovery somewhere along the line, and I don't think we will. And we have to recognize that too. I don't know if you have any answers, any comments on that, but that's the engineer in me that talks.
I think the reality is, in some ways you're right, and we're going to have to be facing the reality that we're going to have to pay more for energy at the end of the day. And the era of super cheap energy is over. And whether that's coal, I mean, even I was reading the Saskatchewan SaskPower Sustainability Plan, I guess it was published in 2009 on the way here, on the plane here, and it was saying that new coal is going to be sort of on the order of 10 cents a kilowatt hour just to build new coal. So building new anything is going to be more expensive than what we currently have at the end of the day. And so I think that's what we have to start wrapping our head around. Then you start putting carbon capture and storage on that, start putting inflation, start putting carbon prices, start putting new transmission. Costs are going up, period. And I think the idea of comparing everything to current costs, you know, is not the right way to be looking at the question. The question is, you know, what can we afford and how quickly can we make those transitions? You're right, at current prices, we're not going to be powering solar 50% of Saskatchewan, but I don't think anyone's making that argument. The question is, how do you grow that wedge, and how do prices need to decline in order to get where we're going? And I think Germany's been a good example of their rates that they've offered have every year they decline those rates to force the market down. And that's the reason we've seen the development of those technologies at the pace we have.
Great. I've just got a note that the minister is here and waiting for us. He's going to talk about Saskatchewan's energy mix as well in his comments, and so that's in the room next door. Lunch is served. I'd just like to thank our panel. We have a little gift from the Johnson Shoyama School, and on behalf of all my colleagues, thank you for a wonderful morning, really stimulating, and I think has got the debate going, that's for sure. Thank you very much.